Hello. We have an exclusive interview today with a distinguished guest, Mr. Stephen Mansfield. He's a popular speaker. He's New York Times bestselling author of several books, including The Miracle of the Kurds. He has been a leading voice in supporting Kurds in the Middle East, especially in their fight against the ISIS. Welcome, Mr. Stephen.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to start by asking your perspective about the election. As you know, the polls show that the competition is really tight. Do you expect any surprises coming up in the next few days?
I don't. The election is so close that I don't think the email scandal is going to make that much difference. Mrs. Clinton is ahead by an average of about 3%, which is pretty large in an American presidential election. So I think she's going to win. I don't expect any surprises. And we'll be in a new day in American politics.
Do you think this year's election is in any way different from other American presidential elections?
It has been different from other American presidential elections. First of all, a majority of the American people don't like and don't trust both candidates. Right. So the polls have never shown anything like that before. You also have the wealthiest man who has ever run for office running for office, and that has an effect. Even though he hasn't had to spend a lot of his own money, still he has money when he needs it. And it's been perhaps the most contentious of presidential elections. Maybe not the most, but one of the most contentious recently. So it's very different. I think what's going on now is that people are not so much voting for who they trust or who they like. They're voting for who channels their anger, who reflects what they're angry about. And so this election is very divisive, very tumultuous, very angry, and I think it's going to mark the country negatively.
Interesting. So now, speaking about how people outside of America look at the election, do you think the outcome of this election would change America's foreign policy at all?
I think so. Both of the candidates are more conservative than Mr. Obama and his administration. Mrs. Clinton only slightly more conservative, and of course Mr. Trump much more conservative. Right. So I think there will be a change in direction. Now, one of the questions that we all have to ask is, does the Clinton Foundation and all of the funds that the Clinton Foundation has taken in from the nations of the world, will that affect Mrs. Clinton's foreign policy? In other words, is that pay for play, as they say, where people are giving money to have access, is that real? And if that's real, that may be a factor. But yes, I think we'll have a very different direction in foreign policy no matter who wins.
Right. So let's get more specific. Speaking about the Middle East, and especially the case of the Kurds, as you know, they're becoming more and more important in the region, playing a key role in the fight against the ISIS, but we also have the movements towards independence. Yes. Do you think for U.S. foreign policy, the outcome of this election would change the situation of the Kurds at all?
I do think it'll change the situation of the Kurds. Mr. Obama has been hesitant to strongly back the Kurds and has only recently begun to do what he should have been doing his entire administration. For example, he has said to Mr. Erdogan, we're going into Raqqa whether you want us to or not. And that's not a policy he would have held a year ago. I think both Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump will be more decisive. I don't know that Mr. Trump understands a great deal about the Kurds. Mrs. Clinton has already said that she will be more supportive of the Kurds. In fact, in the presidential debates, she's the one who mentioned the Kurds twice. Yes. So I think we'll see more attention to the Kurds. Right. If it's Mrs. Clinton, more understanding of the Kurds. If it's Mr. Trump, we'll just see a very strong anti-ISIS, anti-extremist kind of attitude in the Middle East that will also help the Kurds. So I think the election will improve the situation of the Kurds in general. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Mrs. Clinton has been more leaning towards supporting Kurds, but there are analysts who argue, and there are articles after articles coming up saying that Washington does not actually have a clear strategic plan as to how to deal with the Kurds, and what we have been witnessing so far would be just a temporary policy of let's use the Kurds for the time being, and you know the history of betrayals and all that because you've written about Kurds. Do you think history is going to repeat itself? Do you think Washington is going to have a strategic idea of how to deal with the Kurds after ISIS, perhaps?
I have a slightly different view than some of the leading writers about this, and that is I think Washington knows what to do. I think we have a strategic plan. I think we're afraid of executing it. And the reason is that the U.S. wrongly, I think, plays to the Saudis and plays to Turkey too much. And so if you're playing to Turkey and you're playing to the Saudis, then the Kurds are going to be the losers. The other thing the U.S. does is overplay to Baghdad. And I think that we're going to have to modify some of our laws and some of our agreements as we exited Iraq, and begin to help the Kurds more directly. Now that is the mood in Washington. That's even the mood at the White House. Right. It's time just to back the Kurds directly, and even Mr. Obama is talking that way. But I think Washington knows what to do. I think they're just afraid to do it because they've chosen the wrong friends in the Middle East.
Right. So given that Turkey is an important ally, is a member of NATO, U.S. is using its bases, why do you think it would be right for Washington to change their policies in terms of picking Kurds over their enemies?
Well, you know, Mr. Erdogan has been an embarrassment to Washington. He's bombed his own populations, as you know very well, using the PKK as an excuse. He's tried to keep the U.S. from going into Raqqa, which Mr. Obama has said we're absolutely going to do. So I think the U.S. is beginning to realize that they have got the wrong partner. And you know, you can only have a partnership in professions and professional life like in business. Right. If you and I are in business together and we have to do the things we say we're going to do and be honorable. Right. If Turkey is not honorable when it comes to the Kurds, when it comes to its own population, you know, the recent coup, the response to that has been so troubling. So the U.S. is, as we would say, souring on
Right.
Turkey and realizing that we don't have a good partner there. That's, in my opinion, a good thing because I think it's time for us to wake up. So I think it's time for a shift from Turkey to more of the Kurds, and then allow Turkey to still be a U.S. ally only if it begins to keep its agreements and behave itself in essence.
So those are great observations, what you mentioned as to giving reasons why Washington needs to update its policies. Mm-hmm. But on top of other factors that we just talked about, there is also Russia coming to the region mm-hmm. and siding with Turkey. And so in terms of the threat that now Turkey might join the Assad, Russia, mm-hmm. Iran, do you think it would be a threat for the U.S. to lose another ally to Russia?
Well, I think the U.S. is always trying to keep all of its allies, and maybe too much so. Even Mr. Putin has said that an independent Kurdistan may have a place in the future. Even he has said this. Mm-hmm. So I think that Russia is a little unclear as to their intentions. They're obviously interested in Mr. Assad, but there's no love between Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan. So I don't think you're going to see Turkey be a strong ally to Russia, and then of course again with Mr. Assad. So I still think the state of the Kurds can be good even with that evolving, and that's why the United States, I think, needs to negotiate a bit more with Mr. Putin, be less of just a blind ally to Turkey, and force Mr. Assad to start making some sense and doing the right thing by his people. And I think that there are good things that can come from this.
Okay, so Mr. Mansfield, as you know, Kurdistan is moving towards independence, and there have been discussions of holding a referendum after the U.S. election. What's your view on that?
I'm strongly in favor of the referendum. And polls show that the majority of Americans are in favor of Kurdish independence. Obviously, you know, we became a country in our own movement of independence, and so we support independence movements like that. And where I see people responding the most is when I tell audiences in the U.S. that 35 million people are in the world, and they're the largest people group without their own homeland. And that's when Americans really say, well, then they've got to have one. So not only because the Kurds have earned this by fighting ISIS so valiantly, and by sustaining so many years of opposition and persecution, but the Americans have really become allies. So I'm
Absolutely.
behind it.
I have observed the same thing in terms of American nations' reaction to Kurdish independence, but what Americans think don't always match what Washington thinks. So how do you gap that that difference of perspective between what the government thinks and what people think?
Well, the government's dealing with all of its alliances, you know, and its treaties and its negotiated agreements. But there's a very strong popular movement in the U.S. in support of the Kurds, and I think that's why you're hearing the Kurds mentioned in the debates. Whether you agree with Mrs. Clinton or not, she's a good politician, and she knew that the Kurds were a hot button with the American people, and that's why she mentioned it twice in the debates. So I think there is general support for Kurdish independence, there's support for the referendum. Madam Bayan, Sami Abdul Rahman, has done a great job in helping us understand the situation better in America. So I'm supportive of it, so are most of the American people.
Perfect. Is there anything Kurds in the U.S. can do to create a momentum around this? What do you recommend?
Yes, I strongly recommend that Kurds speak up. I strongly recommend that they educate. I strongly recommend that they lecture in schools and help the American people understand. The Americans are not very well taught about Middle Eastern affairs. They barely, until recently, couldn't really distinguish the Kurds from everyone else in the Middle East. And so get known, speak about these things, write about these things. I think that Americans are hungry to know more, and that's why my book did well, and other books like it have done well, because the Americans are hungry to know who these amazing people the Kurds are.
Okay, so what you mentioned in terms of Kurds being out there and reaching the right audience is absolutely valuable, but as you know, Kurds live in the margins of the society, and even though there's a thirst to get to know more about Kurds, Kurds aren't in that position to offer the education that you just talked about because of a lot of financial reasons, being immigrants, and a lot of other reasons. How do we gain the position, or how do we put ourselves in that situation where we can get people to listen to us and to listen to our stories?
Well, I spend half of my year every year in Nashville. And the Nashville Kurds are very careful to invite a lot of people, dignitaries, congressmen, senators, to picnics and to gatherings and to events, and they give awards. And then some of the leaders write articles, and so the Kurds are better known in Nashville because they do that. I would say the same thing needs to happen in other communities. Use that wonderful Kurdish gift of hospitality and influence people. One of the strongest supporters of the Kurds in the U.S. Congress is Marsha Blackburn, and the reason is, of course, the Kurds in Nashville just sort of adopted her and said, you may not know who we are, but we're going to tell you, and then we want you to speak for us, and she's doing it. So that's the kind of thing that's going to work. The smarter Kurds with advanced degrees need to write articles and volunteer to lecture in the colleges and the universities, and just continue to make this a cause. Americans are open, but they don't know what they need to know.
We will be back with you and Mr. Stevens and his book after a short break. So we're back here with Mr. Stephen Mansfield, the New York Times best-selling author of several books, including The Miracle of the Kurds. He's a very popular speaker, and he has been a leading voice in supporting Kurds in the Middle East and in their fight against the ISIS and in their movement towards independence. Mr. Mansfield, you have written several books. You've written about politics. You have written biographies. What inspired you to look at the Kurdish nation specifically?
Well, I was living in Nashville, Tennessee when the Kurds began to pour in by the thousands. You know, Nashville still, I think, is the largest Kurdish population in the U.S. And I didn't know much about the Kurds, but I began to befriend them and just get to know them like a lot of Nashvillians did. But I had at that time a lot of involvement in American politics. So when they would tell me their story and tell me what the needs were and discuss things with me, I had friends in Congress and in the White House that I could talk to, and so I kind of became a voice for them. And then I began going to Kurdistan. There were a couple of NGOs and other organizations that began working amongst the Kurds during their hardest times. And I really lost my heart and was engaged in my mind by the story and the history. And so that's what made me decide to write this book and try to tell Americans a little bit of what I knew about the Kurds.
When you say you lost your heart, can you be more specific?
Oh, goodness, yes. You know, the Kurds are, as you well know, a very unique people. The friendliness, the hospitality, the history, the stories, the passion, the fire, and then of course just the heroic nature of the Kurds against Saddam, against ISIS. So all of those things captured me. And then I'm a historian by training, so I began to read deeply and read back through the centuries and learn things I had never learned in school.
Right.
So all of that set my mind aflame.
Great. So mixing both your skills, being a historian, you have looked at several nations and what has happened to them throughout history. You've also specifically looked at Kurds. Given everything you just mentioned about Kurds, they're non-aggressive people, moderate people, don't invade anyone's country, don't impose anything on anyone. Why is that they have had one of the most painful and tragic histories in the Middle East?
Well, in the last maybe 100, 150 years, I don't want to say it was the Kurds' fault, but at certain strategic moments in history, when they might have been handed, you know, independence or might have been helped to rise, they weren't ready. I wrote about this in the book in the late 1800s, heading into, you know, the World War I period. They were betrayed. There's no question about it, and betrayed horribly. At the same time, part of the reason that people didn't take them seriously is there was a big religious conflict happening at the time and division and so on. So the Kurds have been betrayed, and the Kurds absolutely have not been supported like they should have. At the same time, the only thing the Kurds can do is prepare themselves for leadership, prepare themselves for stability, and it just has been a bad fit between the opportunities and the moments the Kurds were prepared. But I think that's changing now, and we're going to see some exciting things happen in the coming years.
Well, that's an insightful comment, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg story, right? Because if you've been oppressed, if you've had such a harsh life, if you've been rendered homeless, you've been denied the opportunity to educate yourself and being able to interact with the rest of the world, then how are you going to prepare yourself to have it?
Exactly.
So, but things are changing now, right? This is perhaps one of the best times in the history for the Kurds. And you talked about being prepared. Could you elaborate on that? What exactly do you think we should do?
Well, you know, when I talk to people on the Hill in Washington, D.C., they love the Kurds, but they're concerned about certain factions, certain families, certain control. Are the Kurds really ready for democracy? They're asking. And of course, their attitude is, well, they deserve democracy whether they're ready or not. They'll have to make it work. But divisions, what they call strong men, you know, certain people controlling the destiny of the nation, that's what concerns them. So if we're going to prepare for democracy, if we're going to prepare for independence, we have to deal with those structures. We have to deal with the things that might, pockets of corruption and manipulation of the people and so on, if there's anything of that nature. I'm an outsider, so I can't speak to it specifically, but we know that's part of the issue. Also, the people have to be prepared for democracy. What will that mean for them at the level of the street? What will free markets mean for them? You know, that kind of thing. I personally think the Kurds can do it and do it well. I think in some ways they've got greater democracy than other countries in the world. I'm often telling people on the Hill, look, when I go to Kurdistan, I see the state of women, I see a Yazidi and Christian department in the government, I see more evidence of democracy than I do in many other countries. So I think they're ready. But those are the things that play in people's minds when they're concerned about Kurdish independence. And so if we deal with those things, do a little bit more PR, explain to the world who we are, so to speak, I think that will go a long way.
So it's like you have held a nation in chain for over a century, and now you have removed some of these chains and you're asking them to walk, and they wobble, and you're saying, well, why are you wobbling? Like, what is Washington, D.C.'s realistic expectation of Kurdistan? Like, how are we going to go the distance that took them over a century to walk? They're expecting us to walk that in a few decades. So don't you think they need to be a little bit more understanding towards the Kurdish situation?
I absolutely do, and you put your finger on an important issue. The story you just told, coming so far over the centuries, you know, you want us to walk and we've been in chains. See, that's a story that's not being told very, very much. Until Madam Bayan and a few other people began to speak openly in this country and began to articulate the Kurdish cause, there was really no person. You know, Israel has Netanyahu, who comes and speaks so well with English, and other countries have their one representative, or the people groups, they've got someone who speaks English well, they've got somebody who can come and sit with the president, and the kings of Jordan have all been that kind of figure. You know what I'm talking about. The Kurds need those kinds of people. Come, speak, articulate, tell that story. It's not good enough for Stephen Mansfield to be telling that story. You have to be telling that story. Other people have to be telling that story, because most Americans don't know it. So if we're going to excuse, and we should, a little bit of wobbliness with the Kurds as they take the first steps towards an independent nation, then we're going to have people who understand why they're a little bit wobbly, and that story is not being told.
So throughout our conversation, you pointed out rightfully the value and the importance of Kurdish lobbying. And it's not like there aren't educated Kurds out there. We have a lot of dedicated Kurds out there. In fact, like, a lot of us go out of our way to promote the Kurdish cause, to talk about it. But we aren't given the opportunity. We aren't invited on CNN or Fox News. We aren't invited to White House as much as we should be. So how do we bridge that gap? How can we strategically lobby to get our voice and our stories to the right people, to the decision makers?
Well, you might not be able to get to the decision makers on your own, but you probably influence people who are prominent, people who are visible. I mean, I wasn't that prominent when Kurds first began to talk to me about what was going on. Then I became a little bit more prominent, and I had already, as I say, lost my heart, and so I was able to speak, and then I have a pretty broad platform now to be able to speak. So even if you can't get into a congressional office or a senator office, there are influential people that you know. Books need to be written. Op-eds in newspapers need to be written. I personally filmed a Kurdish demonstration, a peace demonstration in front of the White House where they were saying, "Down with ISIS, up with democracy, we love you, America," and I said, nobody's filming that. So I filmed it just on my iPad, on my iPhone, and showed it to a lot of people in the press, and they actually used the clip. So it's not the easiest thing in the world, but to be clear about it, all the Kurds who are capable of doing it in America need to be more vocal, saying these things, telling the story, writing articles, doing everything they can. And with social media, a 16-year-old Kurdish boy can have a tremendous influence with a blog and Twitter and etc. And better funding for the Kurdish outreaches. There should be a Kurdish study center in America. Madam Bayan's office should be 10 times bigger than it is. You know what I'm saying? I appreciate so much what she does, but it's got to be even bigger. The other offices should be bigger and more prominent. And but I don't want to be negative. Good things are happening. Minds and hearts are being changed. We just need to. It's time to push.
So, given your background and the depth of the information that you have, if you're given the chance to advise next president of the United States specifically about the Kurds, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to adjust their level of devotion to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. I would tell them to adjust some of the agreements with Baghdad. I would tell them to announce themselves in support of Kurdish independence. I would tell them to appoint me the first ambassador to an independent Kurdistan. No, I'm just playing. And I would tell them to be prepared to help give birth to Kurdistan and all that means. It'll mean military support, mean financial support. It'll mean definitely financial support in recovering from the current war, helping to deal with the humanitarian crisis that, for example, Mosul is creating. And rightly so. The Kurds have been so wonderful in taking in so many refugees. So all of those things, and I'm sure that probably neither Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump really know the details of all of that. But those are the things that I would advise right away. I think we should see an independent Kurdistan in the next 3 to 5 years.
It's been an honor to have you here, Mr. Mansfield. Thank you so much for everything you've done for the Kurds so far and for being with Kurdistan 24 today.